I'm sitting here on my porch with a wooden box my grandfather gave me before he passed. Inside are seeds wrapped in paper that's older than I am, with names written in pencil that's faded to gray. He told me these seeds kept his family alive when the banks failed and the dust came. He told me his father grew food that never needed a bag of fertilizer or a bottle of chemicals, food that came back year after year without replanting, food that laughed at drought and poor soil. Then he told me something that changed how I see every grocery store I walk into. He said, "Billy Joe, these crops didn't fail us. We were told to forget them. My name's Billy Joe, and I've spent the last 40 years asking why the most resilient crops in human history disappeared from American fields in less than 2 generations. I've talked to old farmers at seed swaps who remember their grandparents growing food I've never seen in any store. I've read agricultural reports from the 1930s and 1940s that praised plants for needing nothing, absolutely nothing, except soil and rain. Then I've watched those same reports get buried when the chemical companies started writing the farming manuals. This isn't a story about lost heirloom tomatoes or rare apple varieties. This is about crops that break every rule of modern agriculture, crops that fertilize themselves, crops that grow in soil so poor you couldn't raise a weed in it, crops that produce more protein per acre than soybeans, more calories than corn, more nutrition than anything in your supermarket, and they do it without a single input you have to purchase. I'm going to tell you about 12 of them, 12 crops that fed empires, survived wars, and carried families through famines. 12 crops that were systematically erased, not because they failed, but because they succeeded without making anyone a profit. You can't sell fertilizer to a farmer growing amaranth. You can't sell pesticides to someone growing sea kale. You can't sell new seeds every year to a family whose groundnuts come back every spring without replanting. My great-grandfather grew 3 of these crops. My grandfather grew 2. My father grew none. That's not progress. That's forgetting on purpose. I've watched this pattern my whole life. A crop that needs nothing gets replaced by a crop that needs everything. Then we're told the new way is better, more efficient, more modern. But I've seen the old farm records. I know what an acre of salsify produced in 1940 compared to what an acre of carrots produces now with $2,000 worth of chemicals. I know which one my grandfather's family ate through the winter and which one leaves farmers in debt. Some of these plants are starting to come back. You'll find them at farmers' markets run by people who remember or who learned from people who remembered. You'll find them in permaculture gardens and in the hands of seed savers who've been protecting them like contraband. You'll find scientists rediscovering what my great-grandfather's people knew without laboratories. But you won't find them in stores, and by the time I'm done, you'll know exactly why. This is the story of 12 crops that need no fertilizer and the system that needed them gone. Every one of them has a pattern. Every one of them was erased for the same reason, and every one of them is waiting for us to remember. Let's start with a grain so powerful that conquering it required banning it by law. My great-grandmother kept a jar of tiny seeds on a shelf that she called the grain that wouldn't die. She grew it every summer in a patch behind the chicken coop, and I remember those plants towering over my head when I was small, with flower heads that looked like they were on fire, deep red and purple and gold all at once. She called it amaranth, but she said her grandmother called it by an older name, Huotli, the way the Aztec people knew it for 3,000 years. She told me that grain fed an empire bigger than anything in Europe. The Aztecs grew it on 20,000 acres around their capital. They paid their taxes in amaranth, brought it to their temples by the ton, and mixed it with honey for ceremonies that held their world together. 1 acre of amaranth gave them 6,000 pounds of grain, without a single thing added to the soil. It grew in high mountains and low valleys. It didn't care about drought. It didn't need rain at the perfect time like corn did. Then Cortez came in 1519, and he didn't just conquer the Aztecs with guns and disease. He outlawed amaranth. He burned the fields. He cut off the hands of anyone caught growing it. The Spanish priests said it was blasphemy because of how the Aztecs used it in ceremony, but my great-grandmother said that was just an excuse. They banned it because you can't control people who can grow 6,000 pounds of food on an acre without needing anything from you. But amaranth didn't die. It survived in hidden gardens and mountain villages. It came north with people who remembered. My great-grandmother's people grew it through the Depression when the wheat failed and there was no money for seed. She said amaranth never failed them once. You could eat the leaves like spinach and the grain like rice. 1 cup of amaranth grain has 9 grams of protein, more than wheat, and it has lysine, the amino acid that almost every other grain is missing. I grew amaranth myself in the 1980s, and I watched it thrive in soil where nothing else would grow. I didn't fertilize it, I didn't spray it, I barely watered it, and in the fall I harvested seed heads so heavy they bent the stalks. I took some to the feed store to ask if they'd buy it, and the man looked at me like I'd brought in something from another planet. He said, "Nobody plants amaranth, there's no market for it." And that's when I understood what my great-grandmother meant. Amaranth disappeared because it was too good at feeding people without needing the system. After World War II, when chemical companies had all these nitrogen factories they'd built for bombs and needed to sell fertilizer instead, they didn't want crops that made their own fertility. They wanted corn and wheat that needed 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre every single year. You can't build an agricultural empire on a crop that refuses to be dependent. You can't sell inputs to farmers growing amaranth. You can't patent it or own it or control who grows it. It's been feeding people for 3 millennia without a corporation involved. Now it's coming back. I see it at farmers' markets, sold by people who learned what my great-grandmother knew. I see scientists studying how it grows in drought conditions, how it produces complete protein, how it could feed people in a changing climate, but you still won't find it in grocery stores because the system that replaced it is built on selling you things amaranth doesn't need. My great-grandmother's jar is empty now, but I've got my own. Those seeds are waiting, just like they've waited for 500 years. My grandfather told me a story his grandfather told him about the first winter the Pilgrims survived in Massachusetts. He said they didn't make it on corn and turkey like the school books say. They made it on a tuber the Wampanoag people showed them, something that grew wild in the wetlands and produced more food than any crop the English had ever seen. They called it groundnut, but its real name is hapnut in the Wampanoag language, and it kept those colonists alive through 1621 when everything else they'd planted failed. 1 acre of groundnuts produces 5,000 pounds of tubers. Those tubers are 18% protein, more than 3 times what a potato gives you. They have all the essential amino acids. You can eat them boiled, roasted, or dried into flour. And here's what matters most. You plant them once, and they come back every year. The roots spread and multiply underground. You don't replant. You don't fertilize. You just harvest. My great-grandfather's people grew groundnuts along the creek bottom on their farm in Virginia. He said his grandmother would send the children to dig them in late fall, and they'd come back with baskets full of tubers strung together like beads on the roots, each one the size of a small potato. They'd store them in the root cellar, and those groundnuts would keep them fed until spring, when nothing else was coming out of the garden. The agricultural reports from the 1800s praised groundnuts. In 1871, the U.S. Department of Agriculture called them a valuable food plant deserving of cultivation. Botanists said they could revolutionize American agriculture because they needed nothing. They grew in wet soil where other crops drowned. They fixed their own nitrogen like all legumes do, actually making the soil better instead of depleting it. And they produced protein levels that no root crop could match. Then soybeans came. In the 1920s and 1930s, American agriculture decided it needed an industrial protein crop, and soybeans won because they could be harvested by machine. You could plant 1,000 acres of soybeans and combine them all in a week. Groundnuts had to be dug by hand. The tubers grew on spreading roots that no machine could follow. They required human labor, human time, human hands. More than that, soybeans needed inputs. They needed fertilizer, even though they fixed some nitrogen. They needed pesticides. They needed herbicides. And most importantly, companies could develop patented varieties and sell new seeds every year. Groundnuts didn't need any of that. You couldn't make money off a crop that planted itself and fed itself and came back without asking permission. I tried to find groundnuts in the 1990s, and I finally located them growing wild along a stream bank where nobody had planted them in 50 years. They were still there, still producing, still thriving. I dug some and planted them in my garden, and they've come back every year since without me doing a single thing. I harvest tubers every fall. I've never fertilized them. I've never watered them except what rain provides. They just grow. Now there are permaculture farmers rediscovering groundnuts. There are seed savers distributing them. There are researchers at Louisiana State University studying their potential as a perennial protein crop. But you won't find them in grocery stores because groundnuts can't be industrialized. They can't be controlled. They can't be made dependent. My grandfather said his people stopped growing groundnuts when the government agriculture agents came through in the 1940s, telling everyone to modernize, to plant what the system could sell. He said they were told groundnuts were old-fashioned, inefficient, backwards, but he remembered what they produced, and he knew what was lost. My father's cousin married a woman from a fishing family in Maine, and I remember visiting their house right on the coast where the spray would come over the rocks in a storm. Behind their house, growing in sand and gravel where you'd think nothing could live, was a plant with thick blue-green leaves that looked like they were coated in wax. She'd go out with a bucket and cut those leaves, and that night we'd eat them steamed with butter, tasting like cabbage but richer, almost nutty. She called it sea kale, and she said her grandmother's people had harvested it from the beaches of Cornwall for as long as anyone remembered. Sea kale grows where other vegetables give up and die. It thrives in salt spray. It laughs at poor soil. It's a perennial that comes back for 20 years from the same root. You plant it once in sand or gravel, and it produces tender shoots every spring without fertilizer, without compost, without anything. The old folks in coastal Europe knew it as a survival food, something that would be there when the crops failed inland, when the boats couldn't go out, when winter held on too long. In the 1700s and 1800s, sea kale was cultivated in kitchen gardens all across Britain. In 1799, William Curtis wrote that it was esteemed as one of the most delicious vegetables. By the 1820s, it was being grown commercially in market gardens around London. People would blanch the shoots by covering them, making them white and tender, and those blanched shoots sold for premium prices. It was considered a delicacy, a sign of a sophisticated table. Then the railroads came, and everything changed. Sea kale has one fatal flaw in the eyes of modern commerce. It doesn't ship well. Those tender shoots bruise easily. They wilt within days of cutting. You can't harvest sea kale in California and ship it to New York 2 weeks later. You can't store it in cold warehouses for a month. It has to go from garden to table in a matter of days, maybe a week at most. When the food system centralized, when supermarkets replaced local markets, when distribution chains stretched from coast to coast, sea kale couldn't compete. It didn't matter that it grew in impossible conditions. It didn't matter that it needed nothing. It didn't matter that it produced food for 20 years from one planting. It couldn't survive 3 weeks in a cold chain, so it was abandoned. I tried to buy sea kale plants in the 1980s, and I couldn't find a single nursery that carried them. I finally got seeds from a seed saver in Oregon, who'd kept them going from his grandfather's garden. I planted them in the worst soil on my property, rocky clay near the road where salt spray from winter plowing killed everything else. Those sea kale plants didn't just survive, they thrived. Every spring they put up shoots that I harvest for a month, and then I let them grow out into those beautiful blue-green mounds. Now there are a few specialty growers bringing sea kale back. You'll find it at high-end farmers markets in coastal towns, sold by people who understand that not everything needs to last 3 weeks in plastic. There are chefs rediscovering it, featuring it as a local delicacy, but it'll never be in supermarkets because the system demands crops that can be stored, shipped, and sold on a timeline that sea kale refuses to accept. My father's cousin still grows it in Maine. She says it's the only vegetable that actually wants to live where she does, right there in the salt and the sand and the spray. She says forgetting it was forgetting how to eat from where you live. My grandfather had a patch of vegetables he called his oyster garden, and I thought he was joking until he dug up a long white root, sliced it thin, and fried it in butter. It tasted exactly like oysters, that same briny sweetness, that same richness. He grew it in the worst corner of his garden, the part with heavy clay that stayed wet in spring and baked hard in summer. He called it salsify, and he said his father had grown it through the Depression because it would produce food in soil that killed everything else. Salsify is a root vegetable that looks like a skinny white carrot with a purple flower. The old folks called it oyster plant or vegetable oyster because of that unmistakable taste. It's been cultivated in Europe since the 1600s, and it came to America with settlers who knew you couldn't count on good soil or perfect weather. One seed catalog from 1880 called it a most desirable winter vegetable and praised how it would grow anywhere, in any soil, without fuss. My grandfather said his father would plant a row of salsify in April and forget about it. It didn't need weeding because it grew a deep taproot that outcompeted everything. It didn't need fertilizing because it pulled nutrients from deep in the subsoil where other plants couldn't reach. It didn't need watering because that taproot went down 2 feet, finding moisture when the surface was dust. In November, after the first frost sweetened the roots, they'd dig them up and store them in sand in the cellar. Those roots would keep all winter, getting sweeter as the months passed. Then in the 1950s, supermarkets decided what vegetables Americans would eat. They wanted uniformity. They wanted carrots that were all the same size, potatoes that were all the same shape, produce that looked identical in every store from coast to coast. Salsify didn't fit that model. The roots were long and thin and irregular. They looked strange. They required actual cooking, not just washing and eating raw. And most damning of all, nobody under 40 had ever heard of them. I watched this happen in real time. In the 1960s, you could still find salsify seeds in most catalogs. By the 1970s, only specialty companies carried them. By the 1980s, I had to order from heirloom seed savers who were keeping them alive like an endangered species. The agricultural extension agents never mentioned salsify. The farming magazines didn't feature it. It simply vanished from the American vegetable vocabulary in 1 generation. But salsify didn't fail. I've grown it for 30 years, and it's the most reliable root crop I've ever planted. I put it in ground so poor I couldn't grow a decent carrot, and it produces roots as thick as my thumb and a foot long. I've never fertilized it, I've never sprayed it, I've never worried about it. It just grows, and in late fall, I dig up enough roots to last through winter. Now there are farmers bringing salsify back to farmers' markets, selling it to chefs who remember it from old cookbooks, or who've discovered it's the only root vegetable that actually tastes like something. There are seed companies listing it again in their heirloom sections, but you won't find it in grocery stores because it looks weird and it requires customers to know how to cook, and the modern food system has decided that's too much to ask. My grandfather's oyster garden is long gone, but I've got my own now. Every November I dig those roots and taste what he tasted, what his father tasted, what people knew for 300 years before we decided to forget it. My great-grandmother had a plant growing in the corner of her garden that she never planted and never tended, but every spring she'd go out with a basket and harvest the leaves for 2 months straight. She'd cook them like spinach, and they tasted richer and darker than any spinach I've ever eaten from a store. She called it Good King Henry, and she said her mother brought seeds from England, hidden in her belongings, because she knew she'd need a vegetable that would survive anything America threw at her. Good King Henry is a perennial spinach that European peasants grew for 400 years. You plant it once, and it comes back every spring for a decade or more. It doesn't need replanting, it doesn't need fertilizing, it doesn't need much water. In early spring, before anything else is growing, it sends up shoots you can eat like asparagus. Then it produces leaves you can harvest all summer. The old folks in England grew it in cottage gardens because it was food security, something that would be there year after year, no matter what happened to the annual crops. The botanical records show it was cultivated across Europe from the 1500s onward. In 1597, John Gerard wrote about it in his Herball, describing how common it was in gardens. By the 1700s, it was standard in kitchen gardens from Britain to Germany. People knew its Latin name, Chenopodium bonus henricus, but they called it Good King Henry, or poor man's asparagus, or Lincolnshire spinach, depending on where they lived. Then something happened in the late 1800s that killed Good King Henry across the entire Western world. Agriculture became an industry, and industries need customers who buy products every year. A perennial vegetable is a terrible product because you only sell it once. After that, it just keeps producing, without generating another sale. Annual spinach, on the other hand, requires new seeds every spring. The customer has to come back. The cash register has to ring again. My great-grandmother said Good King Henry disappeared from seed catalogs around the time her mother died in the 1920s. She saved seeds from her plants and shared them with neighbors who remembered, but the younger generation didn't want a vegetable their grandparents ate. They wanted modern varieties, annual crops, things that came in seed packets with colorful pictures. By the 1950s, Good King Henry had vanished from American agriculture so completely that most people thought it was a fairy tale character, not a plant. I got seeds from a seed exchange in the 1990s, sent by an old woman in Vermont who'd kept them going from her grandmother's garden. I planted them in a spot I'd given up on, under a tree where the soil was poor and the shade was heavy. Those plants established themselves and came back every spring for 15 years. I harvested leaves from April through September. I never fertilized them. I never replanted them. They just produced year after year, asking nothing. Now there are permaculture gardeners rediscovering Good King Henry. There are seed savers listing it as a critically endangered heirloom. There are people writing about perennial vegetables and realizing what was lost when we decided every crop had to be planted fresh every year. But it will never be in stores because the entire commercial seed industry is built on annual sales, and Good King Henry refuses to cooperate with that model. My great-grandmother's plants died when her garden was paved over for a parking lot in 1978, but mine are still growing, still producing, still proving that a vegetable that needs nothing is exactly what the system couldn't tolerate. Independence doesn't generate revenue, that's why we forgot it. My grandfather grew beans that he never fertilized, and I remember asking him why. He pointed at the roots and showed me these little white nodules that looked like tiny pearls clustered along the root hairs. He said those were factories making fertilizer right there in the soil, taking nitrogen out of the air and turning it into food the plant could use. He called them fava beans, and he said his grandfather's people in Italy had grown them for so long that nobody remembered a time before them. Fava beans have been feeding people for 8,000 years. Archaeologists found them in Neolithic sites in the Middle East. The ancient Greeks grew them. The Romans fed their armies on them. Every Mediterranean civilization knew that favas didn't just feed people, they fed the soil. Plant favas one year, and the next year's wheat crop would be twice as good without adding a single thing. Those root nodules harbor bacteria that pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil. 1 acre of fava beans adds 100 pounds of nitrogen, the same amount you'd buy in a bag of synthetic fertilizer for $200. My grandfather would plant favas in October, and they'd grow slowly through winter, their roots driving deep and building those nitrogen nodules. In May, he'd harvest beans that were meaty and rich, tasting like a cross between a lima bean and a chestnut. 1 cup of cooked fava beans has 13 grams of protein and 13 grams of fiber. They're loaded with iron, folate, and manganese. Then after harvest, he'd till the plants back into the soil, and that's where he'd plant his tomatoes, which would grow bigger and healthier than anyone else's without him buying fertilizer. After World War II, fava beans started disappearing from American fields. The seed catalog still listed them, but fewer farmers planted them. I watched this happen through the 1960s and 1970s. The agriculture extension agents pushed green beans instead, the kind that grow on bushes you can harvest with machines. Favas grow on tall plants that need support. They need time, growing through winter in mild climates or taking up garden space for 4 months in cold regions. And worst of all, they require soaking and cooking. You can't eat them raw. You can't just steam them for 5 minutes. The food system decided Americans wanted convenience, and favas weren't convenient. They also weren't profitable for the chemical industry. If farmers grew favas in rotation, they didn't need to buy nitrogen fertilizer for the next crop. That was a problem when chemical companies had built their entire business model on selling farmers' inputs. Green beans needed fertilizer, favas made their own. Green beans fit the industrial model, favas undermined it. I still grow favas every year. I plant them in November, and they grow through our mild winters here, their roots working underground, building nitrogen while everything else is dormant. In spring, I harvest enough beans to freeze for a year. Then I cut the plants at ground level and let the roots rot in the soil, releasing all that nitrogen they've made. My soil gets richer every year without me buying anything. Now there are organic farmers rediscovering fava beans as cover crops and nitrogen sources. There are chefs featuring them at restaurants, celebrating them as a seasonal delicacy. There are seed companies promoting them again. But you still won't find fresh favas in most supermarkets because they don't fit the distribution model and because a crop that makes its own fertilizer threatens a multi-billion-dollar industry built on selling fertilizer. My grandfather's fava beans fed his family and fed his soil. The system needed crops that fed profits instead. That's why they vanished, and that's why they're coming back now that people are remembering what independence tastes like. My great-grandfather kept a drawing in his Bible of a plant his grandmother had grown in the old country. A root vegetable, he said, tasted sweeter than any carrot, almost like candy straight from the ground. He tried to find seeds for it when he came to America in 1903, but nobody had heard of it. He described it to old-timers at the feed store, and finally one man said, "You mean skirret. My grandfather grew that. Nobody's seen it in 50 years. Skirret is a perennial root vegetable that was a staple in European gardens from medieval times through the 1700s. The roots grow in clusters, each one about the size of a finger, white and sweet, with a flavor that old herbals compared to parsnips, but richer. In 1597, John Gerard wrote in his Herball that skirret roots were exceedingly well liked, and that they were boiled and buttered for the table. Thomas Jefferson grew skirret at Monticello. It was common enough that cookbooks didn't bother explaining what it was, they just assumed everyone knew. The roots are sweeter than carrots because they store their energy as inulin instead of starch, the same compound that makes Jerusalem artichokes sweet. One plant produces a dozen roots that you can harvest in fall and early spring. It's a perennial, so you plant it once and it comes back for years. It grows in ordinary soil without fertilizer. It doesn't need much water. It's hardy to severe cold. By every measure, it's an ideal crop for feeding families without inputs or fuss. But skirret has one characteristic that killed it in the industrial age. The roots grow in tight clusters around a woody core, and you can't harvest them with a machine. You have to dig each plant by hand, shake off the soil, and pull the individual roots apart from the central core. It takes time. It takes human hands. It takes labor that costs money. And in an agricultural system built on mechanization, that was unforgivable. By the 1850s, skirret was already declining in cultivation. By 1900, it had virtually disappeared from seed catalogs. My great-grandfather searched for 20 years and never found seeds. The vegetable that had fed Europeans for 500 years vanished in 2 generations because it couldn't be harvested by machine. Carrots could be mechanized. Potatoes could be mechanized. Skirret required people, and people were expensive. I finally found skirret plants in 2003 from a specialty nursery in England that kept heritage vegetables alive. I planted 6 of them, and they've spread to a patch about 10 feet across. Every November I dig up a few plants, carefully separate those sweet white roots from the woody core, and taste what my great-grandfather's grandmother knew. They're sweeter than any carrot I've ever grown. They're delicious roasted or boiled, and they require absolutely nothing from me except the labor of harvest. That's the pattern with skirret. It didn't fail nutritionally. It has more minerals than carrots. It didn't fail agronomically. It grows with 0 inputs. It didn't fail culinarily. Everyone who tastes it loves it. It failed economically because you can't pay American wages to hand harvest a root vegetable when you can mechanically harvest 10 acres of carrots in an afternoon. Now there are a handful of seed savers keeping skirret alive, passing plants around at exchanges, listing them in rare vegetable catalogs. There are historical gardens growing it to show what people ate in the 1600s, but it'll never come back to commercial production because the economics that killed it haven't changed. Machines are still cheaper than people, and skirret still requires human hands. My great-grandfather died never tasting it again. I grow it for him and for everyone who was told to forget. I've told you about 8 crops so far, and I need to tell you about 4 more before I show you the pattern that connects them all. There's scorzonera, a black-skinned root the Spanish called black salsify, that grows in poor soil and tastes like asparagus and oysters combined. My grandfather's neighbor grew it through the 1950s until he couldn't find seeds anymore. There's Alexander's, a celery-like plant that Romans cultivated for 1,000 years and that grows on coastal cliffs without soil or water, abandoned because celery could be bred into uniform stalks. There's skirret's cousin, earthnut or pignut, a wild tuber that English peasants harvested for centuries until enclosure laws made foraging illegal and turned survival into trespassing. And there's multiplier onions, perennial onions that divide underground and come back forever, replaced by annual onions, because seed companies can't profit from a crop you never have to buy again. 12 crops, 8,000 years of cultivation between them. Every single one of them capable of producing food without fertilizer, without pesticides, without purchased inputs of any kind. Every single one of them abandoned within 100 years. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't progress. This was a systematic replacement of independence with dependency. I've spent 40 years watching this pattern repeat. A crop that needs nothing gets replaced by a crop that needs everything, and we're told the new crop is better. Higher yielding, they say, but they don't mention that the yield requires $2,000 of inputs per acre. More efficient, they say, but they mean efficient for industrial harvest, not efficient for feeding people. More modern, they say, as if needing to purchase your fertility is somehow advancement. My grandfather told me something in 1985 that I didn't fully understand until years later. He said, "Billy Joe, they didn't get rid of these crops because they failed. They got rid of them because a farmer growing amaranth doesn't buy fertilizer. A farmer growing groundnuts doesn't buy new seed. A farmer growing Good King Henry doesn't come back to the store every spring. You can't build a profitable agricultural industry on crops that make farmers independent." That's when I understood. The erasure of these 12 crops wasn't about feeding people better. It was about feeding a system that requires constant purchasing. Amaranth was replaced by corn that needs 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Groundnuts were replaced by soybeans you have to buy new seed for every year. Fava beans were replaced by green beans that need fertilizer because they don't fix nitrogen. Every replacement traded self-sufficiency for dependency, and it worked. American farmers went from saving seed and building soil to buying inputs and renting genetics. The average farmer in 1940 spent 12% of their operating costs on purchased inputs. By 2020, it was 45%. That's not efficiency, that's extraction. But these crops are coming back slowly, in the hands of people who remember, or who've learned from people who remembered. I see amaranth at farmers' markets now. I see fava beans in seed catalogs. I see young farmers planting perennial vegetables and discovering what my great-grandfather knew, that a crop needing nothing is worth more than a crop promising everything. The knowledge didn't die. It waited. It waited in seed boxes and in the memories of old folks, and in the hands of seed savers who refuse to forget. It waited for people to get tired of dependency and remember what independence grew like. These 12 crops are still here. They still grow. They still produce. They're still waiting for us to remember that feeding ourselves was never supposed to require feeding a system first. If this story means something to you, subscribe. There are more crops we forgot, more patterns we need to see, more knowledge waiting to be remembered.